The Apache girl took an arrow for him, and he offered his land to her tribe. He heard the snap before he heard the scream, the sharp, vicious sound of a bowstring releasing somewhere in the cottonwoods above the river, and his body reacted a heartbeat too slow, instincts honed from years on the frontier urging him to dive, move, duck, anything. But before he could throw himself out of the open trail, a blur of movement cut across his vision. The Apache girl, barely more than 18, slipped from the brush with the silent speed of a hawk, her braid whipping behind her as she shoved him hard enough that his boots skidded across the dirt. The arrow meant for his throat struck her shoulder with a sickening thud. She didn't cry out, she just gasped, a sharp breath that folded her to her knees as the shaft jutted from her flesh. He spun. Rifle half raised, scanning the tree line for the archer, but whoever had fired had already slipped back into the woods, leaving only the echo of that deadly hum hanging in the still morning air. When he looked down at her, the girl was gripping the arrow's shaft with trembling fingers, trying to break it off before her attacker circled back, her jaw set in a fierce, stubborn defiance that didn't match the blood running down her arm. "Don't," he said, dropping beside her. "You'll drive it deeper." She jerked away from him, eyes wide, breath quick, her body angled like she might spring away even in her pain. But the effort cost her, and her vision blurred long enough for him to see fear underneath the warrior's pride. "Why'd you do that?" he asked, stunned, lowering his voice as he pressed his hand gently above the wound to slow the bleeding. "Why take an arrow for me?" She didn't answer. Didn't need to. Her gaze flicked back towards the trees, toward the direction the archer had retreated, telling him the truth he hadn't pieced together yet. That arrow hadn't been meant for her. It had been meant for him. Someone had been watching him, hunting him, and she had seen it first. He slipped an arm behind her shoulders, lifting her carefully, ready to carry her if she fought him or not. "You're hurt bad," he murmured. "If that head's barbed, you'll bleed out long before you reach your people." She grimaced, but didn't resist as he pulled her against his chest. Pain was weakening her, but pride wasn't. "My name's Holt," he said, as if giving her that truth might steady her. "And I ain't leaving you here to die." She blinked at him, confusion flickering through her dark, fading eyes. Apache didn't save white men. Not on these lands. Not with tribes and settlers eyeing each other like storms waiting to break. Yet she had. And now the cost was written in blood down her arm. When Holt lifted her fully into his arms and started toward his cabin, the weight of her sacrifice settled on him like a brand he hadn't earned, an unspoken debt carved into the morning sun. He didn't know her name, didn't know why she'd done it. But as her head fell weakly against his shoulder, he made a vow he didn't say aloud. Whatever reason she had for saving his life, he would not let her pay for it alone. Holt pushed through the underbrush with her in his arms, moving fast but careful, every jolt sending a shudder through her body as she bit down on her pain, with the discipline of someone raised to endure more than most grown warriors. Her blood warmed the front of his shirt, soaking into the fabric in slow, frightening pulses, and even though he tried to steady his breathing, each drop reminded him how little time he had to get her somewhere safe before that arrowhead worked deeper into the muscle. She wasn't unconscious, not fully, but drifting, her head lolling against his shoulder, her eyes half open as if she were watching him through layers of fog. "Stay with me," Holt muttered, tightening his hold. "I need you awake." Her fingers twitched weakly at the sound of his voice, curling into the fabric of his coat, as though instinct forced her to cling to the only stable thing in reach. But her gaze flicked toward the river trail again, like she was still listening for the archer who had vanished into the trees. Holt followed her eyes but saw nothing, only the quiet sway of leaves hiding more secrets than he could count. "Why'd you jump in front of me?" he asked under his breath, half to her and half to the cold morning air. "You don't know me. I ain't worth dying for." She didn't respond, but something in her expression tightened, as if she disagreed, or as if the truth was more complicated than he understood. He pushed on across a small rise, his cabin finally coming into view, a modest structure nestled between two cottonwoods, smoke still curling faintly from the chimney where he'd left the fire banked earlier that morning. Relief loosened his shoulders, but only a little. "Almost there," he said, lowering his voice to a steady, reassuring rumble. "You hold on, I can fix this." Her breathing hitched sharply as another wave of pain tore through her, and she fought to pull away from him, murmuring something in Apache he didn't understand, but recognized from the tone. A warning. "Easy," he said, pausing just shy of the cabin door. "Ain't nobody here but me." She shook her head, just barely, and a flicker of urgency flashed in her half-lidded eyes. She wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't afraid of the cabin. She was afraid of what might have followed him. The realization settled like a stone in his gut. Whoever shot that arrow hadn't given up. He kicked the door open with his boot and stepped inside, laying her gently on his bed, careful not to jar the arrow. "You saved my life," he murmured, looking down at her. "But I don't know why. I don't know what you were trying to tell me." Her lips parted, a whisper slipping out, soft, strained, desperate. Not English, not a word he knew. But her eyes, even through the haze of pain, held the message clear as daylight. Danger was coming. And she had taken the arrow not out of loyalty, but to buy him time. Holt knelt beside the bed, breath tight, hands steady out of pure necessity as he inspected the arrow buried in her shoulder. The shaft was snapped halfway from her attempt to break it, the fletching stained dark, the head buried too deep to pull free without causing more damage, and he cursed under his breath, knowing he'd have to push it clean through to get it out. Something she wouldn't survive unless he stopped the bleeding first. He reached for the tin basin and clean cloth he kept on the shelf, his fingers moving with the speed of a man who'd patched bullet holes and knife wounds before. But this felt different. This wasn't a ranch hand or a tavern brawler. This was a girl who'd stepped between him and death for reasons he still couldn't fathom. When he pressed the cloth against her wound, she jerked awake with a sharp cry. Her hands shooting up to shove him away, but she was too weak, her arms collapsing against his chest as she gasped, "Nah, nah." The word wasn't English, but the fear behind it was. "Easy," Holt said, catching her wrists gently, lowering them. "I ain't taken it out yet, just stopping the flow." She sagged back against the pillow, breath trembling, sweat beading along her hairline. Holt dipped the cloth into the water again, watching her eyes flutter open, closed, then open again. Dark eyes that fought him like a wounded hawk, but trusted him enough not to claw. "You should have let me take it," he muttered, pressing the clean cloth down again. "Folks die every day on this trail. Would have made more sense than you getting yourself shot." Her gaze sharpened the slightest bit, a flicker of defiance lighting behind the pain. She whispered something again, longer this time, strained and broken, but Holt didn't recognize a single word. "I don't know what you're saying," he murmured, "but I know danger when I see it, and somebody out there wants me dead." The truth tasted bitter. He didn't have enemies, or so he thought, but murdering arrows didn't fly from ghosts. Someone had tracked him. Someone had waited. Someone had drawn on him with the kind of precision that only came from focus and intent. He wrung out the cloth, cleaned the edge of the wound, then pressed his hand gently along her collarbone to check for cracking. "You're strong," he said quietly, almost in disbelief. "Stronger than most men I've treated." Her breath hitched, her eyes closing. Her fingers brushed his wrist, just barely, as if trying to grip something real before slipping under again. Holt covered her hand with his, steadying her. "I'm gonna keep you alive," he said, voice low, solid. "I don't know your name, but I owe you mine." Outside, a branch snapped, too heavy to be wind, too sharp to be coincidence. Holt froze, muscles locking tight. Then he moved to the window, peering through the crack in the shutter. Someone had followed them after all. And whoever it was, they were close enough to finish what they started. Holt stayed perfectly still at the shutter, breath shallow, eyes narrowing at the faint movement between the cottonwoods. Shadows shifting where shadows shouldn't shift. A flicker of feathers, a glint of metal catching what little daylight slipped through the branches. Someone was out there, more than one someone, moving with the discipline of warriors trained to blend into the brush. And he knew immediately these weren't the same hands that fired the arrow. These were scouts, trackers, Apache warriors who moved like ghosts across the snow. Behind him the girl stirred, a soft, pained murmur slipping past her lips, and Holt glanced back at her, jaw tightening. If they had followed her blood trail, they'd assume the worst, that a white man had taken her, harmed her, or worse, and frontier justice didn't wait for explanations. As he watched, 3 figures broke from the tree line, painted faces streaked with charcoal and ochre, braids bound tight for battle, bows half drawn but not loosed yet. They weren't here to ambush. They were here to reclaim her. Holt stepped away from the window and went to his rifle, then stopped before his fingers touched it. If he armed himself, the moment would turn bloody. If he walked out unarmed, he might not walk back in. He cursed under his breath, moved to the bed, and knelt beside her. "I need your help," he whispered. "If they see you awake, even hurt, they might wait to hear your word." Her eyelids fluttered, heavy and exhausted, but she managed to focus on him, breathing shallow. She tried to sit up and failed, the pain nearly knocking her under again. Holt steadied her gently, lifting her against the pillow. "Stay awake," he murmured. "Just long enough." A hard knock slammed against the door, shaking the hinges. Holt flinched. Another hit followed, sharper, demanding. He rose, leaving the door barred but standing where they could hear his voice. "She's alive," he called. "And she's hurt. Arrow in her shoulder. I didn't touch her wrong. I didn't take her." Silence pressed against the cabin walls, thick, calculating. Then a voice answered through the wood, deep and edged with barely bridled fury. "Bring her out! Now!" Holt's heart hammered. If he moved her, she'd bleed out. If he refused, they'd break the door down and kill him before asking a single question. He turned back to her. She was awake enough now, pain sharpening her gaze. She whispered one word, soft, breathless, but clear. It was his name. "Holt." His chest tightened. "I'm here." She swallowed, winced, and with trembling fingers lifted her hand, pointing toward the door. Not in fear, but in insistence. She wanted him to show them she lived, because if they saw her breathing, saw her alive, they might spare him long enough to hear the truth. Holt took a long breath, unbarred the door, and cracked it open just enough for the warriors to see her on the bed. The reaction was immediate. Rage, shock, wounded devotion carved into the face of the man who stepped forward, clearly a leader. Clearly someone who cared deeply for the girl fighting to stay conscious. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Harm her, and you die slowly." Holt opened the door wider, stepping back so they could see the truth. "I didn't harm her," he said. "She took the arrow meant for me." Outside, the warriors went still as stone, and the night, heavy with fury, shifted ever so slightly toward judgment. The Apache warriors didn't storm the cabin the way Holt feared. They crowded around the doorway instead, silent shadows bristling with anger and suspicion, watching every breath he took as if waiting for the smallest hint of guilt. The leader stepped inside first, his expression carved from stone, his eyes burning with a mixture of dread and fury as he knelt beside the girl, his hand hovering over her arm without touching, as though he feared the contact would break her fragile hold on consciousness. She opened her eyes at the movement, pupils dilated with pain, and whispered something in Apache, too faint for Holt to catch. Whatever she said, it shattered the leader's composure. His jaw clenched, shoulders stiffening as he looked from her wound to Holt, as if calculating whether rage or gratitude would win the moment. "She bleeds because of you," he said, voice dangerously low. Holt didn't flinch. "She bleeds because she saved me." The leader's nostrils flared, a subtle shift of disbelief and something like confusion. Holt continued, his tone steady, calm. "Arrow was meant for my throat. She shoved me out of the way." The warriors murmured behind him, whispering in quick, tense bursts, their distrust thick but fraying around the edges. The leader inspected the arrow, his fingers brushing the broken shaft. "If we move her, she will die," he said, not asking, but stating, heavy with certainty. "If I don't take it out," Holt replied quietly, "she'll die anyway." The leader straightened slightly, suspicion returning sharp. "You know how to do this?" "I've taken bullets out of men on cattle drives who had less fight than she does," Holt said. "But she needs heat, clean water, and a steady hand. Out in the cold, she won't last." Pain twisted across her face as she tried to shift, a broken breath catching in her throat. The leader leaned closer, his voice dropping to something softer and more frantic. "Rest. Be still." But she shook her head faintly, lifting her fingers toward Holt as if urging him to continue. Holt moved to the stove, warmed his knife, and laid out the cloths again, the warriors tensing with each step he took. They didn't trust him, had no reason to, but they also didn't have another choice. He knelt at her side, meeting her eyes. "This is gonna hurt," he murmured, "but if we don't do it now, you won't wake again." She nodded once, tiny, weak, but full of the kind of courage that reminded him why she'd leapt in front of that arrow in the first place. The leader hovered over her like a storm waiting to break. "If she screams," he warned, voice trembling, "and it is because of you, then kill me," Holt answered simply, "but let me save her first." Something passed between them then, a threadbare trust woven from desperation. Holt steadied her shoulder, gripped the broken shaft, and with all the precision he owned, pushed the arrowhead through until the metal tip broke the skin on the other side. She gasped. Sharp, wild, but didn't scream. Holt's heart hammered as he sliced the arrow free, blood spilling hot against his hands. The leader bowed his head, whispering a prayer under his breath, as Holt worked to bind the wound. The girl drifted, her breaths shallow, her strength slipping, and the warriors, ready to kill him minutes before, now watched in terrified silence, praying the stranger's hands were steady enough to keep her alive until dawn. Holt sat beside her long after the warriors settled into a tense semicircle around the cabin, their silhouettes visible through the shutters like restless shadows, guarding the threshold between life and death. The girl lay breathing shallowly but steadily, her skin glistening with fever, her braid tangled against the pillow, the fresh bandage at her shoulder already blooming with slow, stubborn bleeding. The leader, Gray Hawk, as one of the younger warriors whispered, remained nearest to her, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on Holt with a suspicion that hadn't eased even when Holt saved her. "Why was she on the trail alone?" Holt asked quietly, mostly to himself, but the question drew a tightening in Gray Hawk's jaw. For a long time, the Apache man didn't answer, his fingers brushing the girl's wrist as though trying to anchor her to breath. Finally, still watching her, he said, "She was not alone." Holt frowned. Then where were the others? Greyhawk's eyes shifted to him, dark, sharp, assessing. "We hunted those who hunted you." Understanding snapped into place so suddenly Holt felt his breath leave him. "That archer, he was after me?" Greyhawk nodded once, his expression carved with certainty. "A man you wronged." "I haven't wronged anyone," Holt muttered, bewildered, but Greyhawk's silence said he believed that less than he believed in the sunrise. "Why would she step in the path of an arrow meant for me? She don't even know my name." Greyhawk finally shifted his full attention onto him, the weight of his stare nothing short of piercing. "She knew." Holt blinked. "Knew what?" Greyhawk's voice dropped, low and edged with something Holt couldn't read, something that felt old, painful, and reverent all at once. "That you spared a boy 3 winters ago." Holt's heart stilled. A memory, foggy at first, rose from the back of his mind. A young Apache boy trapped under the fallen trunk of a snow-weighted pine, the snowstorm closing in, Holt cutting him free, carrying him miles to his people, leaving the boy at the edge of a campfire's glow before disappearing into the blizzard so they'd never know who helped. "The boy lived," Greyhawk said. "The tribe remembered." "She," he nodded at the girl, "was his sister." Holt looked down at her, stunned. The girl, pale from blood loss, seemed so small on his bed, far too small for the weight of all this. "But how'd she know it was me?" Greyhawk lifted the edge of Holt's coat, mud-stained, torn from years of hard riding. The boy spoke of a man with a coat like storms and boots that never stopped walking. "She recognized you." Holt swallowed, the truth hitting him square in the chest. A girl had taken an arrow because of an act of mercy he'd nearly forgotten. An act he hadn't wanted praise for, hadn't even told another soul about. "She owed me nothing," Holt whispered. Greyhawk's gaze softened, the first crack in his hard exterior. "That is why she repaid it. We do not forget the hands that lift our own." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the distant howl of a lone coyote. Inside the small cabin, Holt stared at the wounded girl, finally understanding the truth he'd been chasing since the moment she fell into his arms. She hadn't saved him because she was Apache. She had saved him because once, years ago, he had been human when others were not. And now humanity had circled back to him in the most painful way possible. By the time the sun dipped low behind the cottonwoods, the clearing outside Holt's cabin had filled with more riders. Older men with braids threaded in white, faces lined with the years and battles that carved wisdom deeper than the scars on their hands. These were the elders, the ones who decided truth from lie, justice from rage, war from restraint. And the moment they dismounted, the air thickened with a kind of authority that made even the younger warriors straighten their backs. Inside the cabin, the girl drifted in and out of fevered half-sleep, her breaths shallow, her pulse flickering like a candle stumbling in the wind. And Holt could feel Greyhawk's tension rising with every minute she failed to wake fully. When the elders knocked, not violently, but with a measured firmness that carried the weight of command, Greyhawk opened the door without looking at Holt, and 4 men stepped inside, their eyes scanning the small room with the slow, deliberate precision of men who missed nothing. The eldest among them, White Branch, judging by the carved bone pendant at his chest, walked to the girl's bedside and knelt, his hand hovering inches from her face before he closed his eyes in a silent prayer. When he rose, he turned to Holt, his expression unreadable. "You pulled the arrow through," he said calmly. "She would have died if you had not." Holt inclined his head but didn't step closer. "She may yet die," another elder muttered, eyeing Holt with suspicion hot enough to burn. "If she does, the blame lies with the man she saved." Greyhawk's jaw tightened. "She saved him because he saved my brother." The elder's gaze slid to Holt. "Mercy given to a child does not mean trust earned with a tribe." Holt didn't argue, didn't defend himself. He wasn't here to win their trust. He was here to keep her breathing. "You came to demand something," Holt said quietly. "Say it." Whitebranch stepped forward, his voice steady. "We demand to take her home." Holt felt the blow before it landed. Moving her now, with her wound freshly bound, would kill her. The fever alone would break her before they reached the ridge. "She won't survive the ride," Holt said, shaking his head. "Let me keep her warm. Let me treat the fever. At dawn, if she's strong enough, you can take her." One elder stepped forward, fury twisting his features. "She is Apache, not yours to keep." "I'm not keeping her," Holt said, voice calm but solid as stone. "I'm trying to save her." Whitebranch studied him, long, hard, assessing the truth not from Holt's words but from the steadiness in his voice. "The girl chose to save this man," he murmured to the others. "If she dies tonight, her spirit walks alone. And if she dies on the trail," Greyhawk snapped, "she dies because we were impatient." The elders stiffened at his tone, but Whitebranch finally raised a hand for silence. After a long, heavy moment, he spoke. "Then she stays," he said quietly, "until the sun touches the top of the eastern ridge." Relief washed across Holt so sharply he had to steady himself. But the elder wasn't finished. He pointed a finger toward Holt, his eyes narrowing. "If her breath falters, or if you touch her in dishonor, we will end you before your next heartbeat." Holt nodded once. "Deal." The elders stepped back, forming a silent ring around the cabin as night closed in. And Holt returned to her side, knowing he had only hours to keep a promise that suddenly felt bigger than his own life. Dawn had barely begun to push its pale light across the clearing when Holt stepped out of the cabin, the cold morning air hitting him like a slap after hours spent inside fighting the fever that clung to the girl like a second skin. Behind him, she slept, weak, trembling, alive, but holding on by threads. And outside, the Apache warriors formed a semicircle around a newly built fire pit, flames crackling low as the elders took their places with the solemnity of men, preparing to weigh not just one life, but the balance between two worlds. Greyhawk stood among them, arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes shadowed with fear he refused to show. Whitebranch raised a hand, and the warriors parted to make a narrow path for Holt. A path no white man had ever walked willingly. Holt didn't hesitate, not because he wasn't afraid, but because fear didn't matter when a girl's life lay inside on a bed he'd stained red, with her blood trying to keep it inside her body. He approached the council fire and stopped when Whitebranch signaled, the rising smoke curling between them like a fragile thread. "You stand on Apache ground," the elder said, "and you stand here because our daughter breathes for now." Holt nodded once. "She's strong." Another elder stepped forward, eyes sharp as obsidian, too strong to save the life of a man who is not her kin. Holt didn't flinch. She did. Murmurs rippled through the warriors, the weight of disbelief and wounded pride mixing together. Whitebranch lifted a carved staff and planted it in the dirt. One winter, long past, a boy returned home babbling about a white man who saved him. A man who carried him to safety without taking praise or reward. His gaze pinned Holt. "That was you." Holt didn't deny it. Didn't figure it needed mention. "It does today," Greyhawk muttered, stepping forward so the firelight illuminated the hard grief in his face. "Because my sister knew your face. She knew your coat. She knew she would repay a debt that our people had not." Holt swallowed, guilt tightening his throat. "It wasn't a debt." "It became one," Greyhawk snapped, pointing toward the cabin, toward the faint sound of her ragged breathing filtering through the logs. "When she took that arrow meant for you." Holt lowered his gaze, not out of shame, but out of the impossible weight of what she'd done. "Then let me repay it," he said quietly. "Let me keep her alive." White Branch's eyes narrowed. "Why? Why risk displeasing your own people to save a girl who is not yours?" Holt lifted his head, voice firm. "Because she chose me over death. Because she protected a life that wasn't part of her tribe. Because someone hunted me, not her, and she paid the price." The council fell silent. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the morning air. Finally, White Branch spoke, his voice low and grave. "If she lives until sundown, we will honor your hands." His eyes darkened. "If she dies, Apache justice will meet you before night." Holt met that verdict with steady calm. "Then I'd better keep her breathing." And as the elders stepped aside, granting him passage back to the cabin, Holt felt the weight of an entire nation settle on his shoulders, one girl's life binding him to a future he never expected to face. By late afternoon, the fever had settled into a dangerous rhythm, rising, falling, then rising again like a tide trying to drag her under. And Holt stayed beside her every time her body jolted with pain, cooling her forehead with damp cloths, whispering steady words she couldn't fully hear, but somehow responded to with the faint tightening of her fingers around the blanket. Outside, the warriors kept watch, their tense shadows sliding past the shutters as the sun crawled across the sky toward the ridge that marked the elders' deadline. Greyhawk entered only once, hovering in the doorway like a man standing between hope and despair, his jaw clenched so tight the tendons in his neck strained. "She sleeps?" he asked. Holt nodded. "Still breathing?" Greyhawk's eyes closed briefly, relief fighting fear. And when he opened them, there was something softer there, an exhausted gratitude he didn't want Holt to see. "If she dies," he said quietly, "my mother will not speak for a moon. My brother will carry her name like a wound." Holt swallowed hard. "She ain't dying today." Greyhawk studied him, weighing the conviction in Holt's voice, then gave a single nod and stepped back outside just as the elders approached the cabin again. White Branch stopped Holt at the threshold, his voice calm but unyielding. "If she lives, peace must be made today. Words are wind, actions bind." Holt understood what he meant even before the elder gestured toward the valley. "Your land sits between our hunting paths and the water," White Branch continued. "It was once ours." Holt stiffened, not in greed, but in surprise. "You want the land?" Another elder's voice cut in, rough with caution. "A gift from you would end all suspicion. It would show your intentions are clean." Holt glanced back toward the cabin, toward the girl whose life he'd fought to keep from slipping away beneath his hands, and he knew exactly what this moment demanded. Something bigger than words, bigger than medicine, bigger than the wound in her shoulder. "You saved her?" White Branch asked quietly. "Now show us why." Holt stepped forward, boots sinking slightly in the packed earth, heart steady in his chest. "Take it," he said. The elders stilled, shock rippling through the older men like a wave. Holt continued, voice firm, sure. "Every acre from the ridge down to the river. The cabin, too, if you want it." Greyhawk turned sharply. "You would give away your home?" "A home's walls don't matter," Holt said. "But what she did, what she risked, that matters." White Branch studied him with the patience of a man who had seen many lies, and almost no truths. Finally he nodded. "The offer is accepted," he said, "not for the land, but for the honor behind it." Greyhawk murmured in Apache, low and reverent. Then he stepped aside so Holt could re-enter the cabin. The sun touched the ridge, gold light pouring through the shutters, and inside, as if waiting for that very moment, the girl breathed deeper, steadier, the fever breaking like a storm spent of its fury. Her eyes fluttered open, weak but clear, and when she found Holt standing there, dust and blood on his shirt, the faintest whisper escaped her lips. "Holt." He knelt beside her, a quiet smile cutting through his exhaustion. "You're safe," he murmured, "and so's everyone else." And outside, the Apache elders watched through the window, finally seeing a man who had given more than anyone had asked, a man they could trust, a man who had offered his land not to buy peace, but to prove a girl's sacrifice meant something real. When the last light of day stretched across the clearing, turning the world gold in a way that made even the hard faces of warriors look softened by something ancient and gentle, Holt stood from the girl's bedside and stepped outside, the door closing behind him with the careful quiet of a man who didn't want to disturb a sleeping soul. The Apache tribe gathered around the council fire, elders seated at the front, younger warriors forming a wide circle around them, and Greyhawk, no longer rigid with fear, watched Holt with an expression caught somewhere between awe and disbelief. White Branch rose first, leaning heavily on his carved staff, the firelight flickering over the years etched into his skin. "The girl breathes," he said, not as a question, but as a statement that carried the weight of gratitude too sacred to speak aloud. Holt nodded. "Fever broke an hour ago." A ripple of relieved murmurs moved through the crowd, some warriors bowing their heads, others whispering brief prayers, and Holt felt the shift in the air. Not acceptance yet, but no longer hostility. White Branch took a step forward, his eyes searching Holt's face. "We have seen many men take from this land," he said slowly, "hunt where they wished, build where they pleased, claim what was never theirs." Holt didn't look away. "I know." The elder tapped his staff against the dirt. "But today we saw a man offer what others would kill to keep." Another elder added, voice quieter but heavy with sincerity, "You offered land not with greed, not with fear, but with honor." Holt shook his head. "Wasn't honor. She stepped between me and death. A piece of land small compared to that." Greyhawk stepped forward until he stood just a few feet from Holt, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "My sister risked everything for you because you saved my brother once. And now—" His voice broke slightly, a rare crack in the armor of a warrior. "You saved her." Holt didn't answer immediately. There were no words that felt right for a praise he never sought. So he simply said, "She's stronger than any of us." The elders exchanged glances, silent, waited, and then White Branch lifted his staff again. "The land you offered," he said, his gaze sharpening. "We return it." Holt blinked. "What?" The elder nodded. "You gave it to show your heart. We give it back because we have seen it." Greyhawk added, "But let it stand this way. Your land is no longer yours alone. It lies under our protection, your cabin, your fields, your river. No Apache will harm you, and no enemy will cross that line without facing us." Holt felt something in his chest loosen, something he hadn't known was bound. "I don't deserve that," he said quietly. "You didn't deserve the arrow," Greyhawk replied. "She chose to take it for you. We choose to stand for you." Behind them, the cabin door opened softly, and the girl appeared, weak, wrapped in Holt's blanket, one hand braced against the frame, but awake, alive, her dark eyes searching for him like a compass finding north, The warriors stepped aside, parting naturally, instinctively, as if recognizing that her presence completed the truth of this moment. Holt moved toward her instantly, slowing only when he reached her so she wouldn't feel rushed. She lifted her hand, shaking but intentional, and touched his forearm, her voice no more than a whisper. "My name is Nara." Holt swallowed, nodding. "Holt," she smiled faintly. "I know." And as the fire crackled, as the elders watched, as the warriors bowed their heads to a peace earned through sacrifice instead of blood, Holt realized what they saw in him was the same thing he saw in Nara. Not a savior, not a debt, not a bargain, just two human beings who chose respect when the world offered them every reason not to. The kind of respect that could tie two nations together more tightly than land ever could. Like, share, and subscribe for more powerful Western dramas from Crimson West. Your support helps us bring forgotten frontier stories back to life.